The Shadow Climate Change and Net Zero Secretary Claire Coutinho is here in the studio with us to talk all things government related today and get the Conservative perspective. Very good morning to you. Good
morning.
Let's start with what the government's announcing today. We had the Health Secretary on last hour, clearly wanting to make sure there is accountability with the extra spending that's going towards the NHS. Do you welcome that renewed drive for accountability?
Well, I mean, the reforms that he was announcing, we announced back in spring in terms of having accountability. And I think it's quite right, just as there's accountability in the private sector, that there's accountability in the public sector as well. The thing that I would say, and what we've been saying as the opposition now, is it's a funny way of going about it when you give people the money first and you negotiate on the reforms afterwards, because we had a productivity plan, we had a workforce plan that we worked up very closely with the NHS. It was welcomed by them, and Labour ditched that when they came in and then just sort of sprayed the cash, as it were. So I hope they get these reforms through. I think ultimately what we all want to see is improved services for patients, and I do think accountability is part of that.
But I mean, the extra spending that was announced in the budget by Rachel Reeves hasn't been given to the NHS yet, so it's not like they're handing the cash over and adding the sort of caveats to it afterwards.
Well, I mean, it would be very hard to see them rolling that back now, but let's see. And like I said, from my perspective, what I want to see is patients getting the best service possible. And I do think that accountability measures, the league table idea that, you know, as I said, we announced it back in spring. I do think that's important as well. Are
you glad to see that the Prime Minister was leading from the front at COP and at a time when a lot of other leaders of his rank, as it were, weren't attending?
Well, the thing that I'm worried about is that what he has done is he's gone and announced a new target, and he has not been clear at all about what this will mean for the British people. And actually, we have been leading from the front for many years. We're the only major economy to have halved emissions since 1990. And in that time, what you've seen is the US emissions have stayed the same. China's are up by 300%. So I would argue, before you are going further and faster with UK domestic targets, we need to be very honest about the trade-offs for the British people. And actually, if that's going to mean increased costs or more hardship, or, you know, punishing measures for industry, which means that they move abroad, then we need to look at that very carefully, because ultimately he's saying we want to be an example to the rest of the world. But if those things happened, you would be a warning, and actually nobody is going to follow your lead.
But I mean, do you support the fact that he did go in person and that we are continuing to aim to lead the world, as you framed it, in the rate of carbon emissions cuts?
Well, this is the point. If you're going to be world leading, we are 1% of global emissions. If you're going to be world leading, you want other people to follow your lead, correct? Now, But
that didn't happen over the 14 years you were in government. Do you still think that we should continue our fight and our momentum behind it?
So, again, this is the argument that I made in post. I was brought in last year to do a reset on net zero and make sure this was reasonable for people. And I think living standards have to come first. This is the argument that I was making and have been making, that if you don't deliver cheap energy for your people, if you don't deliver a great quality of life, and you're cutting emissions here, and you know, your people are seeing emissions soaring in the rest of the world, then actually you're not solving the problem of global climate change. And also you're delivering hardship for the British people. And that's not right. So what I would like to see is a greater focus on the 99% of emissions that happen elsewhere. And I think the UK can play a really useful role, because we can innovate. We've got amazing companies that can produce goods, export them to the rest of the world, that don't have the same capital skill system that we do. And that would have a much greater impact on climate change. And if I may, I think the thing that we're risking at the moment is, you know, Labour came into an election saying they were going to cut bills by £300. They've come up with this Clean Power 2030, which actually I'm really worried is going to make energy incredibly expensive in this country. And all you will see is our industry moving to countries like China, which are still 60% powered by coal. That's actually worse for carbon emissions.
But the pledge is still there to cut bills. Ed Miliband was on yesterday saying he wants to deliver both cleaner energy for the nation and lower bills. You know, we're 4 months in. We haven't seen bills go up relative to any of their plans yet. Obviously, bills did go up
by £150.
Yeah, but not relative to plans he's about to announce today. That's part of the cycle that was left off the back of your government. And bills went up significantly during the administration just passed. So I guess, you know, if this was in 5 years' time, you can say bills have gone up potentially, but you can't say it now.
Well, actually, the IFS have said that now. They said it after the last budget, that green levies, which are policy costs which sit on people's bills, are going up over the Parliament. And that's thanks to the approach that the Labour Party are taking, which is to massively buy sort of into wind at I think, a pace faster than the market can deliver, which obviously is going to push up prices. So what I think is crucial is they came into that election with a £300 promise. We've not seen anything of it since. We actually had a vote in Parliament.
Years.
Yeah, by 2030, we had a vote in Parliament to sign them up to the £300 promise by 2030, and actually they voted against it. So that promise has really fallen by the wayside. And actually, if you look at the report that was out last week, all the risks are that they are going to make energy much more, electricity in particular, much more expensive in this country. And that's something I think we should be deeply concerned about.
Well, the government obviously pushed back. I mean, they can't be measured on the £300 price target for 5 years' time yet. Switching focus though a little bit.
They could have voted for it.
They could have done. There's plenty of things that you didn't vote to bind yourself legally to when you were in government either. Pledges are different from binding laws. Touching on the US election and specifically how it affects your brief, clearly either way, and the government would agree with this, we're going to need gas for an extended period of time. Is there an opportunity to buy a lot of gas from the United States, liquid LNG that could be shipped over here? Or is it more sensible to take it from a nearby supplier, as we do already from Norway?
Well, so look, this is one of the other parts of their agenda, which I think is completely irrational, is that at the moment we get roughly 50% of our gas supply from the North Sea. So that's something which creates jobs in this country. It,
is it that
creates.
High?
It's about 50%.
The majority is from Norway, is it not?
So no, we get about 50% from the North Sea. I mean, that is, out of everything that's produced in the North Sea, domestic gas, all of that goes straight into our transmission gas networks. And actually, one of the myths I think that Ed sometimes says about gas is that automatically goes overseas. It doesn't. It goes straight into the UK gas transmission network. And then we get a big chunk from Norway as well. Now, the question that you want is, do you want to import more LNG? But that actually has 4 times the carbon emissions of our own domestic gas production. So if you're talking about trying to reduce carbon emissions, it makes no sense.
You wouldn't want to import from the US. You wouldn't do a deal with Donald Trump.
I wouldn't pick foreign imports of LNG, no matter where they were from, over domestic gas supply from the North Sea, which, again, like I said, brings in tax receipts. We know that actually their plans for the North Sea mean we'll get about £12 billion less in tax receipts over the Parliament. It supports 200,000 jobs. And like I said, it actually has lower emissions. Now, it doesn't make sense to shut that down in favour of importing gas from abroad. 2
more quick questions, if I may. Trump's team is taking shape as you see the appointments made. Does it add to concern you might have for his administration, what it means for the UK? Does it calm your nerves?
Well, look, from my perspective, in energy and net zero, what I really care about is what's going to happen to people's bills. So I'm very much focused on domestic, cheap energy. How do we get there? How can we make sure that we have a secure supply in this country? And, as we always do in any government, we have to work with whoever's democratically elected to make sure that we can deliver on those key agendas. But in opposition, obviously, what we want to do is hold the Labour Party to account for their policies.
Is oil liquid gold in your book?
Well, look, like I said, we have the North Sea. Lots of countries around the world would love to have the North Sea. It supports 200,000 workers. And I think shutting down that resource, we're not going to need any less. We're not going to use any less. And shutting down that resource in favour of foreign imports is frankly quite mad.
And again, final question, important topic. Just wanted to get your view before we wrap things up. How are you going to vote in the assisted dying bill?
Well, look, I think that's going to be one of the hardest votes for many parliamentarians in their sort of lifetime in Parliament. I think it's a very tough subject. I mean, I've seen people in my family die in a very sort of long, drawn-out, painful way. But we have to make sure the safeguards are there if you think about the elderly, the sick, the vulnerable, disabled. So I will be reading it carefully and considering it carefully. But like I said, I think it's a very, very difficult choice for people.
Claire Coutinho, as always, thanks so much.